This is Matthew, host of the Superhero Ethics Podcast, and I've got an ethical question for you. If I'm trying to help you not listen to ads, is it ethical for me to do an ad to help you do that? If you go to our website, theethicalpanda.com, and just click on the join button, for $5 a month, $55 a year, you get to hear all of our episodes without ads. Was I ethical in doing this? Let me know. Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today I am back with my original co-host, Paul Hoppe, here as a guest, and we're kicking off a new series today, and you'll be kind of shaping it as we go today, because I am in Minnesota, as many of you know, and we've been having, winter's always a problem, but the ice has been particularly worse this year, and I'm involved with a lot of people who are taking actions against it and talking to people who are talking about, what else we can do. And one thing that's happened here in Minnesota is that one of the symbols that's become really important to the people who are working against ICE and against Trump and things like that is what is being called the Minnesota Rebel, or the Rebel Loon, which is the phoenix symbol of the Star Wars Rebel Alliance and Rebellion that you probably know quite well, and that'll be somewhere in the art for this show, mixed with the loon, which is the state bird of Minnesota. Because it's a phoenix originally, and so turning it into a bird, it makes a lot of sense. And I'll make sure we have both of those pictures in the show notes, or at least links to them. And so it's to me, it's, as a Star Wars fan who often doesn't think Star Wars is that culturally relevant, it's been kind of awesome for me seeing how many people have adopted this. And I was having a conversation with someone recently who said, yeah, he loved that symbol, but for him, Star Wars wasn't really what got him thinking about working to make the world a better place, about being a rebel. It was Lord of the Rings, and talking about fighting against Sauron. And that got into this conversation, and someone else had chimed in about Star Trek and other things, She-Ra. And it got me kind of thinking about this question of two questions, really. And by the end of this podcast, I hope I've decided which is the question that's going to be the name of this series. One of them is, what made you a rebel? And the other being, who was your first rebel? And the idea here is kind of to explore with a couple of different people, what's the relationship between how we feel about wanting to take action against sometimes the ruling authorities to make the world a better place, and watching a lot of media, consuming a lot of media that's about doing something fairly similar. And is it that our ideals shape the media we like? Has the media shaped our ideals, or at least given us sort of inspiration and hope in doing the kind of resistance work? How does it all fit together? And so Paul is someone who, he and I have been talking about these kind of topics for literal decades. I'm not going to tell you how many, because I'm rebelling against ageism, and most of which is in my own head when it comes to my age. And we've talked about, the kind of media we talk about, and we've also talked a lot about how we want to see the world a better place and the actions that we're taking, and, how things like this podcast or protests or marches or civil disobedience or any of those things can help to make that happen. So Paul, let me just say welcome and start by asking you a question that I think is going to be broadly similar, but different from each person. How do you define being a rebel?
That's a good question. I will lead with saying that I don't necessarily think of myself as a rebel. If I had to choose an R word to communicate an idea very similar to what I think you're communicating, but I would say that being a rebel essentially entails a rejection of authority. Whether in my own case, I would say it's a rejection of the concept of authority. By and large, I think there are some exceptions where authority is voluntarily given, right? Like if I go to a martial arts school and I say, I want to learn from you, I am giving that person a level of authority to basically tell me what to do, to instruct me to do the thing that I want them to teach me how to do. Right. Which is very different from, it's very different if you're an adult and you go in and do it yourself compared to a child and your parents send you there, and then you have this person telling you what to do, and you didn't really have any agency there. but so for me, I think, being a rebel is both at least the rejection of the prevailing authority, or in some specific context, right? Like you can be a rebel in one area of life, but not necessarily all. It doesn't necessarily have to be political. It can be social. And for me, the word that I alluded to would be revolutionary, which I think is, to me, the idea of being a rebel is there's an extent of sort of defining yourself as being against a thing. And I would say one reason that I resist that notion myself is I don't want to define myself by the thing I disagree with.
Yeah.
I want to define myself on my own terms. And so to me, the idea, even like revolutionary, isn't perfect either, but I'd say I kind of prefer it a little bit, because I feel like there's a little bit of an implication of, if there's a system and you don't like it, or there's a way that things are, whether it's a authoritarian system or whatever it is, it's one thing to reject it, and I'm fully on board with it. And I don't think you need this second thing in order to say, hey, I reject that, and I don't really know what I want in its place, but I know I don't want that. Right. But to me, the idea of being a revolutionary goes a step further and says, okay, not only do I not want that, but kind of this is my solution.
Right. What comes next after the revolution?
Exactly.
Well, and there's a lot of great things you bring up there. And that topic of, okay, the emperor is dead, the Death Star has been blown up, what do we do next, is one we've touched on a number of episodes and will continue to touch on. And also, as you're talking, I'm realizing that I maybe should have clarified my own terms a little more, because rebel has a general context of, someone who rebels against things, someone who's part of a rebellion. I was in my head, though, thinking of it, because I think, if you asked me just to pick a term to describe myself, I'm not sure rebel would be the term, but I'm definitely rebel scum. And what I mean by that is that, because to me, it's a part of Star Wars. It's a part of the, I'm a lot of it's coming out of that, like the Alliance is now the term a lot of us are using here in the Minnesota Alliance is like the Rebel Alliance and things like that.
Yeah.
So I maybe need to, but I think it's a good discussion of kind of how do we define, what that means and what it means to be. So rebel scum may be the term I use going forward. But I'll just say I like kind of what you're saying there, and especially the idea of, for me, one of the things, and this will get into a lot of the media we talk about, that I think I'm always most afraid of in myself and in others, and I'm most inspired by the media that really pushes this, is complacency. Is the idea of, well, this is how things are, and so I'm mildly comfortable, or even I'm very comfortable, or even I'm not very comfortable when I'm alive, and I could be worse. And so I'm not really going to think about what could be. Could it be better? Could there be, and I think it's a very understandable mindset. If your father was ruled by a king and his father was ruled by a king and their grandmother and like going back 10 generations, all you've known is a king, thinking seriously about something different is a pretty weird thought. And if you've always been taught, obey the police and what the police say goes. And if the police say this person was bad and so we had to shoot them, then you just accept that. And, if the government says that we've always been at war with East Asia or Oceanasia or whatever, Oceania or whatever it is, then you accept that. I think I just got the names of 1984 wrong, so forgive me there. But yeah, it is those stories about people who start to say, wait a minute, it doesn't have to be like this. It doesn't, it can be different. It can be better. And I want to be a part of making that happen. I think it's, to me, really at the heart of what being a revolutionary, what being rebel scum means to me.
Yeah, I like that a lot. To me, the core idea that, like, whatever word we want to use for it, the core idea that's most compelling to me is like the idea that things don't have to be the way they've been. And, just because it's been done a certain way for however long, like, that doesn't mean we have to keep doing it that way. Right. Like, and there's a level of energy involved in basically evaluating everything. on its own merits rather than just taking someone's word for it, you know?
Right.
And I think it can be tiring and lead to fatigue. I think there can be like rebellion fatigue, essentially, you know, where it's much more stressful to oppose, you know, the machine, essentially,
Right.
compared to, you know, just going with the flow, essentially,
Yeah.
right? You're swimming against the current.
Well,
But
and I
yeah.
think that's why being able to at times decide to respect someone else's authority and to voluntarily kind of place yourself under that makes a lot of sense. You
Mhm.
know, and I really
Sure.
like the martial arts example you used. I think there's an extent to which I'm kind of the host, and so you're letting me. I have very little power over you. I never have, but you know, there's an extent to which you're letting me kind of decide what topic we're going to do.
Yeah.
My child is sick right now, and the doctors are talking to us about a procedure called inserting tubes into his ears. This sounds horrific to me, and but I know, you know, I did some research. I checked the credentials of the doctors. I checked some credentials of the hospital. But the idea that I would sit there and every time a doctor says something, I'm going to say, okay, well, give me your proof on that, you know, and then Google it myself and do all the research to question the authority of this medical figure who's telling me what I should do with my family. I think a little bit of that is warranted, but I think you're right to go through life and to constantly be saying, okay, I don't trust your authority to tell me what to, um, you know, what kind of medical advice I should be getting. I don't trust your authority to tell me to kick in this particular way and not in that particular way. I don't trust your authority to tell me that I should walk on this part of the trail and not that one, you know, because bears are out there. I don't trust you. Well, no, the bear is going to tell you the camp guide was right. Um,
Yeah.
you know, and I think that thinking it in terms of thinking it in those kind of terms really for me helps this idea of, okay, but so therefore who are the people I don't trust, either because they're not proven trustworthy or because I think they have different goals or because I think they're abusing that power or because I just didn't have any choice in picking them in the first place and I don't like that very much.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think essentially delegating authority is kind of a little bit what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Like essentially saying like, I mean, for me, for a lot of things, I'm like, yeah, I want to understand how the technology works. I want to understand how the medicine works. I want to know why the bears go a certain way. Like I want to learn about things, you know,
Yeah.
and then be able to kind of be like, okay, yeah, what this person's saying makes sense to me. Because I've tried to get some context. I've tried to find a level of understanding. But once, you know, having found somebody who I have a level of trust in, I do want to be like, you know, I'm not going to be trying to tell them how to do surgery, right?
Yeah.
Like, be like, okay, that's what this person does. You know,
Hmm.
I'm sure they're not perfect at it, but you know, as long as I believe they're qualified, like
Right.
they're the one who's going to do it, right? I don't think there's somebody else who's going to do a better job.
And so if they tell you don't have any food or water after midnight, you're going to listen to that directive. You're going to,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not gonna be like, "Oh, well, what do they know? They've just
yeah.
been doing this for you know?" And like, and again, like, it does come back to like, yeah, they might not be perfect, but it's like they probably have I trust that they have a better idea what's going on here than I do, and
Right.
that they are well informed, and that there's like a good reason for most of these things, you know? Um, and then but then if they're like, "Oh, well, I need you to cut off your pinky toe before you come in," you know,
Right.
like, I'm gonna ask more questions. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, or that maybe that probably wasn't the best example to summon, but it
Well,
just,
but
you know,
I think I can give a similar one, which is that, you
yeah,
know, I think when we're young, we're taught to respect a number of these authority figures. And I think, you know, we're taught, hey, listen to the doctor. The doctor knows what they're talking about. Listen to the
right.
martial arts instructor. They know what they're talking about. And one of those that I was also told was listen to the cop. The cop knows what they're talking about.
Mm,
And I think for myself, and I believe for you and for probably most of our listeners, some combination of personal experience and what we see and read on television and on the news and listening to the personal experiences of others have convinced us actually a lot of cops are not really very reasonable people to put trust in that regard, and that there's a lot of institutional biases and personal biases and covering your assness that happens. And cops are, I think, one of the easiest ones to point out, but the same way, like, you know, Not that anyone ever tried to tell me, oh yes, trust salesmen, but if someone comes to my door and says, hey, I think that your roof needs to be fixed and my people can fix it, I believe that that person knows more about my roof than I do. I believe that that person knows more about the potential damage that the hail that just happened last week, and that's why he's there, might have caused. I absolutely do not believe that this person is giving me information in my own best interest.
Right.
And I believe that they're probably trying to just do anything they can to get a sale. And so I'm going to question their authority. And so, we're getting off on this authority tangent, but I think it's an important kind of framing of this, of like, part of the process is figuring out what authorities do you and don't you want to trust.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, if you want to get into the idea of sort of like, where did that idea of being a rebel or revolutionary or not accepting all authority, I feel like there's a pretty good segue here.
I have a segue that I was going to use, and there's a good time for it, but you feel free to reject the premise of this. I think that for a lot of people, not all by any means, but that for a lot of people, one of the first authorities that we get to have some practice pushing against, and depending on how you were raised, you maybe push against a lot or a little, is your parents. And often our first rebellions are against our parents. And I think a lot of people in these kind of movements see themselves as a lot more liberal or a lot more woke or whatever word you want to use than their parents. From the stories I've heard, that's not necessarily the case with you. Your parents were already pretty much rebels themselves.
Yeah. You know, my mom was basically a hippie before there were hippies. And you know, my dad was maybe had more of a beatnik vibe, but like I definitely wasn't raised to like trust and respect the police, you know. Like the word pigs got thrown around, you know, the fuzz, like, you know, not like my parents went around doing a ton of illegal things besides like, you know, maybe certain recreational drugs or whatever, but like, you know, just the, you know, they came of age in the 60s, you know, and we're a part of that whole, you know, idea of not trusting authority. And so I remember having a conversation with a good friend of mine who went to your high school, actually, about how, like, you know, when we were teenagers, this sort of like feeling of rebellion or whatever, but being kind of like, you know, our parents are kind of cool. Like, you know, like we didn't really have that. Like, I mean, there were things my mom wanted me to do that I didn't do, you know, and you could say that I sort of like rebelled against, you know, those very, very mild restrictions. But like it wasn't like, and I mean, like at that time, like as a teenager, I was very angry, but like I wasn't angry at my parents, you know.
Neither your parents nor mine were like, you have to be home at this time, you have to never ever drink. And so we didn't have that like, haha, I'm getting one over on dad or mom by getting blitzed, you know?
Yeah, it was almost like not drinking or doing drugs was rebelling more than like, because, you know, I mean, we hung out with, you know, whatever sort of counterculture group of kids you want to call it. And I mean, maybe a few different, the intersection of a few different kind of, you know, peripheral groups. And most everybody was doing certain things. And I was just like, no, thanks, you know, but like, we'll hang out, you know, it's cool. Like, you do what you want, you know, that's fine, you know, and like, maybe I'll try and catch you before you fall off the roof, like, you know, but like, what, like, it's weird that like, that was in a way, like my own rebellion, you know, it's just like, like peer pressure. No, thanks. Like, it's fine. You can, you can say whatever you want. I'm not going to do what you think everybody else is doing because everybody's doing it, even when that's like the thing that people do to not do what like other people want them to do, you know? And maybe that comes back to the whole, like, not defining myself through doing something different, or like, you know, it's like when there's like a sort of like mainstream, and then you are like, well, I have to do something that's not in the mainstream, because if I do the mainstream, then I'm being conformist. It's like, well, then you're kind of conforming to non-conformism in a way, as opposed to just like just kind of like picking your own thing. Like, this is what I like, like, anyway. Yeah. So I would say that, like, my parents were like a big influence in terms of not so much like not discouraging me from paying attention to anybody who was in a position of authority, because there certainly was like listen to your teachers,
Right.
but not like you must show respect to your teachers, but just like when I was a little kid, like all my teachers were my friends' parents. I went to this the preschool, and like in my building, and like the three teachers were like three of my best friends' parents, and so like the idea of like not trusting teachers was because their parents were cool too, It's like it was a building of performing artists, and and they were all teachers and or performing artists, and so I think I was able to like develop a respect for teachers in terms of the act of teaching, but while rejecting the sort of disciplinary aspects of school, if that makes sense.
No, it really does. And so with that, obviously, I mean, we could just talk about our childhood histories for hours. I'm sure that'd be interesting to at least 3 of our listeners. But we should maybe connect this to media at some point.
Sure.
It sounded like a lot of your ideas didn't start because you watched a movie that made you think maybe your parents are wrong. A lot of this you were getting from home.
Yeah.
But do you remember, like, what were some of the first movies that were either kind of helped shape your feelings or just reinforced your feelings, or kind of gave you a sense of like, I can point to this person and feel like that's kind of a role model or anything like that?
I was going to talk about my cat, but instead, you know what? I don't remember like a moment like that. And I mentioned this when we were kind of talking about the topic, and like, how kind of like how I might be able to fit in with it. Right. And I feel like for me, it was more, I gravitated towards fiction that reinforced that worldview, where, I always loved Star Wars, and it, the rebellion, the Rebel Alliance, like it is at its core, it's about opposing evil authority, really, right? It's like, that's the authority. It has tons of power, and we have to resist it. We have to revolt against it. And if we don't, they're going to blow up planets. And, maybe that's more of a metaphor. But I mean, it's almost literal, right? I mean, we have world governments that could blow up the planet.
And you
literally.
and I, like, our childhood years were certainly at the height of the Cold War, when,
for sure,
we're both children of the late 70s, and the idea that, Russia and America or China could go to war and literally blow up the world was very much a part of our childhood.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I remember going to Return of the Jedi. We've talked about this many times, and being at the Ziegfeld with my dad and my mom, and like that whole feeling of that movie, and seeing that when I was 5. And then, the next year, I remember, like, in terms of media, like, I remember seeing the presidential election and just seeing the whole map turn red. And like, I didn't really understand any of the nuances of politics. Like, I'd already made major life decisions that can be viewed as political in nature. Like, I was vegetarian because I just decided, like, oh, people eat animals. Like, I'm not going to do that, like, and maybe that ties in with my cat a little bit, but who was also totally a rebel, by the way.
Yeah, I want to hear about the cat eventually, for sure.
Yeah, we'll talk about Paul Christopher Hoppe cat at some point.
The fact that you named your cat after yourself is the most Paul thing I've ever heard.
It really is. I named my female cat after myself because I was both narcissistic and rejecting of gender roles at the age of 3.
Yeah.
And wore mismatched socks because I was like, well, I want a red one with a yellow one today. Like, what do you mean I have to wear 2 red ones? And my parents were like, yeah, okay, that's fine. Cool. Express yourself. But yeah, so I think like watching watching movies like Star Wars and heist films. Like my parents were both really into like kind of like crime type things, and kind of rebel. Even if it came to like a cop, it was like Dirty Harry. It wasn't like and or like The Man with No Name in the spaghetti westerns, like Clint Eastwood. My dad was a big Clint Eastwood fan. But I do think like watching like Ocean's 11, even like just this, and that's, I know it's like it's just a heist, right? They're doing it for the money, but like it's like the casino is like this authority, right, that has all this money. It's like, why do they have all this money, and why shouldn't we, kind of? And when I think about childhood heroes, and the fact that I got a lot of this, I'd say, from my mom and some from my dad, probably less from my dad because he died when I was 8. But my mom's childhood, like her big, the hero that she loved the most was Robin Hood, and I feel like, Robin Hood's this, obviously this legendary figure, right? But like, it's not King Arthur, it's Robin Hood, right? And I was always into medieval stuff, but like the rogues as opposed to, the knights. And if it was a knight, it was like a dark knight, and I remember seeing Batman in the theater, and that having this kind of like reaffirming feeling of like, aside from just feeling like, I think black's a cool color to wear. Maybe I'll start doing that again. But like the idea of kind of like, if you don't like the way things are, like you can do what you can to change it. And so I'd say there wasn't a single piece of media that had that effect on me, but just I've always been into the kind of characters that are outside of the system. I mean, I loved Superman when I was really little. He was my first superhero, right? But then like as I got older, not even that much older, I gravitated towards Batman. And like now I love both of them, and like the interplay and things like Public Enemies and like was it World's Greatest Heroes? Is that what it's called? What's it called? You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah,
the one in the animated series where the two of them are together. And not so much Batman versus Superman, but I certainly ended up where like, watching something like the Justice League series where, Superman's like, oh, well, we should turn ourselves into the authorities because like it's the right thing to do, and Batman's like, if you want to clear your name, do it yourself. Don't sit there on the sidelines and like, and like get it done yourself, kind of, because you can't necessarily trust the authorities to do everything right.
Yeah. Well, I love that story, and kind of for me, it opens up a couple of things. First, I was very much with you on Star Wars. I think it was, I've said before, and I think you may have said something similar, I don't remember the first time I saw Star Wars. It was just always a part of my childhood life. And not because my parents loved it. I mean, they did, my mother especially, but I would just like, apparently from before I could remember, just say, this is the movie I want to watch again and again and again. But I definitely remember watching Return of the Jedi. And I think, having a lot of those same feelings, especially this idea of like someone like Luke, that you could like, a total nobody could be the one to make the change. And then the Ewoks kind of really pushing this idea of, even if you're not the ones with the power, even if you're not the ones with all the technology, even if you're the ones that others look down on, you can still come together. But really what I think your kind of story points me towards is that I feel like when we think about the influence media can have on us, there's a number of different ways that can take shape. And that maybe I could say like, there's a number of steps towards becoming rebel scum that media can influence any number of, or from zero to all of them. I have distinct memories of the first time I saw a homeless person in wintertime in New York, and they were cold. And I didn't understand because I knew I had friends who had country houses. And I kind of said to my mom, like, wait a minute, but Billy has 2 houses. That guy has none. Why don't they just give him one of their houses? Like,
like, can't they math? Like,
what is it that kind of teaches you that not only do things not have to be better, not only do things not have to be this way, but you can be a part of making them better.
Yeah.
There's the stuff that inspires you in terms of, hey, here's a possible role that you could play. Like what's the part of being a rebel, or what's the part of the revolution that fits you best. There's the things that give you hope and I think I may be a lot more susceptible to this than you are, but there are certainly a lot of times where, have been a lot of times where it's kind of hard to think that the revolution's going to win. When Trump got elected first once and then twice, when even years before that, like after 9/11, when we were looking to go to war in Iraq, I remember being part of so many protests, and this like the weekend before the attack started, there were protests around the world, and there were so many people, and it was all being documented on the very beginnings of the internet. And I remember thinking, like, there's no way they can go to war now. The world has spoken.
Yeah.
And they did. And then we got into a horrible war in Iraq for multiple years. And I remember just having this sense of hopelessness. And so I went home and I binge watched Star Wars and then West Wing. And so that's another thing that the media can do, is it can be what re-inspired, not what first taught you, but it reminds you, like, there can be hope. We can believe this kind of thing can happen.
Sure. Yeah. The West Wing, a show that reminds us all, like, maybe the United States can have a Latino president.
Right? There's a lot of things in West Wing that at the time was like, okay, this is a bit of a liberal fantasy of what we wish Bill Clinton could be. And now we look and go, oh, you remember when Republicans were like sort of kind of possibly a little bit reasonable, even if we disagreed with them?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It feels like so long ago.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I do really like the idea of having something that you can watch that is inspiring or hopeful, right? That's something that actually we've talked about a lot. And I mean, maybe it's a little too on the nose with Star Wars, but wherein I think, George Lucas said to Dave Filoni when he was doing the Clone Wars, like, don't forget to, like, give them some hope, basically. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not Hawkeye after all, right?
Yeah.
But
the first movie's literally called A New Hope,
Exactly. Exactly. But that, to me, that's one of the things I loved about the series, and something that I always, there are things made today that seem largely lacking in hope, and that paint a very bleak picture. And I'd say, I mean, I said this a long time ago, that I think I would probably describe myself as a cynical optimist, where I think I'm very cynical about the way things are, but on some level, I never believe that that's the way things have to be. And I think that's a very optimistic viewpoint. I mean, if you look at human history, there are horrible things that just happen over and over and over and over. But at the same time, things change a lot as well. Right. And they don't generally change all at once for everyone. And it seems like there's always someone left behind and somebody, under the new boot or whatever. But it does feel like I feel like, I don't know, almost like I have to believe that things can get better. Because like, if not, then sort of like, what's the point? Right. Which is different from feeling like, well, what's the point if I don't know things will be better if I make this effort? Right. It's like, give me the 1 in 100 chance, whatever. Like, I'll take it if that's better than the 0 in 100. Right. So
one of my favorite lines from one of these movies is, in some ways, one of the least hopeful lines, but I think kind of the most, like, cynical optimist or realist optimist, which is in Rogue One, when Jyn is explaining kind of what the plan is going to be, and she says, we're going to take this 1,000-to-1 chance, and then we'll take the next chance, and we'll take the next chance until we win the day, or the chances are spent. And she's basically saying, like, look, we're going all in on every bet,
Yeah,
And
she's describing a poker tournament.
yeah, exactly,
is what she's doing,
exactly.
except it's
when you're very, very short stacked and you got to just
exactly
keep doubling
very
up.
short. Yeah, you
And
just got to rip
and the
it.
way she acknowledges that, she doesn't say, because I know that we'll win. She says,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, we might, this might not work out. The chances might be spent, but we're going to go out fighting. And to me, that kind of like, yes, it's really dark and we have a small chance, but we got to take that small chance. It's optimistic and it's hopeful in a very dark way, but it's believable. Much more so than, oh, I know that, the good people will rise up with us because we have God on our side, or justice on our side, or, the force on our side, or whatever it is.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I feel like in fiction, sometimes, you have to lose in order to make the winning feel convincing, to feel earned. Like, not everything can work. Like, there's a reason that, like, generally narrative structure is like, there starts with a problem, and then the characters try to solve the problem, and then by trying to solve the problem, they've created a bigger problem, and then they try to solve that, and then they create a bigger problem, and then, like, eventually they get it right, or sometimes they don't. But, like, if it has to be certain to do it, then it's like, well,
this is a whole other topic that, on one hand, you and I have been discussing for 20 years and for 8 years online on these podcasts, but I think it's kind of relevant to this as well, because in part, I think it shows the way different media can help different people. I know that for the most part, you don't like stuff that doesn't really, as you said, that doesn't really have much hope. And I think for me, I love a lot of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want it all to be like that, but in part because one of the things that really bothers me is Pollyanna-ness that I see a lot. And I mean that both from people who are like, oh, come on, the system is fundamentally fine, it's going to be okay. Or people who are like, look, as long as we just, get more people registered to vote, or get, find that one piece of news that truly convinces everyone that Trump is bad, or, whatever it's going to be, that everything's going to be okay. When I watch something that's like, no, this is all broken, and there's a lot of good reasons to be cynical, it kind of validates me in a way of like, I'm not going crazy for thinking that it's not going to be that easy. And I kind of interject my own hope into that, but I think that speaks to a very specific need that I have sometimes, that different things speak to you in different ways.
Yeah, for sure. I'll actually give you an interesting example that runs counter to everything that you said. That's just true, right?
Okay.
Generally, I do want, like, things to work out in my stories. Like, I want the characters I like to overcome the characters I don't like. I often want there to be heroes and villains. They don't have to be unflawed heroes and, valueless villains or anything, right? But just like, I do often like having that kind of like a hero who's like just a hero,
Right.
But when I read The Lord of the Rings, so I read The Hobbit when I was like 13, and I loved it. And I actually made a board game of The Hobbit when I was like for a school project. And I know you were talking about something related to that recently, right? And that was really fun. And actually, in it, I said, there were things where I said, like, your friends instead of your opponents. And somebody commented that was like an unusual to write again. I'm like, yeah, but you're playing with your friends, right? Like, and anyway, so I loved The Hobbit, but I got all 3 books of The Lord of the Rings, and I could not get past the first 100 pages of Fellowship of the Ring. Like, I just couldn't. Like, it just wasn't doing it for me.
There's a lot of exclamation points in the dialogue.
Yeah, and then I read the R.A. Salvatore books that we may talk about at some point with Drizzt Do'Urden, and I loved those, and I ended up kind of off on that, which is funny because those are kind of, to some extent, there's some elements borrowed from Tolkien. But then when the movie came out for Fellowship of the Ring, I watched it and I loved it, and then I read The Two Towers and Return of the King. And spoilers for this book from the 50s and movie from the aughts, but when the Ents go on this march and they're like, we are marching perhaps for the last time, maybe to our doom. I kind of had this feeling like they were just all going to die. And like, I was okay with that. I kind of felt like there's something interesting about, this kind of like, they are going to go do this thing and it's not going to work, or it is going to work, but it's going to end in their doom,
Right.
and like, and because I kind of view the Lord of the Rings as being this fable about stuff that happened on Earth millennia ago, kind of, right? It's like, there's like the question, like, well, if it is, then it's like, where did the elves go? Where did the halflings go? Where did the Ents go? And it's like, well, maybe that's where the Ents went, And I kind of thought that's like where it was going to go. And then it didn't. And I don't want to say like super disappointed, but I was just kind of like, oh, I kind of thought that's what was going to happen, And to bring it back to Rogue One, when I saw the preview for Rogue One and like understood what its concept was, I was like, oh, they're all going to die. Like none of the main characters are going to survive this movie. Because if they do, then people are going to be like, well, why weren't they in A New Hope, right? Why weren't they in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi? Like, where did those characters go? And I know there's like kind of some characters who do make it and whatever, but like in terms of the main group, it's like, they didn't make it. But they still succeeded, right? Yeah. They achieved their mission that was essentially turned out to be a suicide mission. But like, and apparently there was like an ending where they did escape or whatever, and then they ended up going with this. And this is just a rare case where I'm like, yeah, I prefer this. Like this feels like the right ending. And I know it's not that they failed and whatever, and so there is still that hope. But I think sometimes that feels to me like the right ending, and like I'm okay with that, and that's fine. The same way that I feel like if I spent my whole life fighting for something and didn't achieve everything I wanted to achieve, but it's kind of like leaving it all on the field, like in sports, it's like the idea that it's like, or any kind of competition, like you give it everything you have. And if you've done that, then you have to be happy with your effort, and so.
Well, and I think that the sports metaphor is really helpful there, but I would say instead of it being so it's okay that you lost, it's more I know I did the best I could as I hand this off to the next person in the relay race. Because, and here's what I was going to say, that like part of why I really love Rogue One, and a general movement, I think, in a lot of that kind of like, the rebels fighting against the authority, whatever it is, or the enemy from outside or from inside, whoever it is, there has been a move sort of away from what is now often termed like the great man of history towards the team effort, the larger effort. And I love Star Wars. I love Luke Skywalker and A New Hope. But I think one of the things that I'm sometimes frustrated by is when things make revolution look too easy and too simple. And that I think when you grow up on that and then someone says, oh yeah, so if you want a revolution, you're going to have to pay a high price. They're like, what do you mean? Like Luke, Han, Leia, they all lived, who cares about Biggs Darklighter? Like it's, the people.
Right.
And so on the one hand, I love that. Like, I do love that in Rogue One, they die. And I think it would have been much worse if they hadn't. But also I love that this was about, but Luke couldn't have done it without all these other people that you don't think about.
Right.
And, some of them you do, like without Han knocking out Darth Vader in a move that doesn't make any sense. But forget, and without
he
R2,
came out of the sun, Matthew, from out of the sun.
Exactly. And, without R2 doing what he did, and C-3PO doing what he did, but also that they couldn't have done it without Jyn and Cassian and all these people who Luke Skywalker will never know their name.
Right.
And
yeah, exactly.
For me, that also gave me a lot of hope because, like, having spent most of my life in the nonprofit industrial complex, as a lot of people now refer to it, and having seen a lot of the problems with it, one of them is people thinking they have to be the one to fix everything. And, when you got 20 people all trying to fix one problem, none of whom think that the others are good enough to do it, guess what? You now have 20 people working against each other instead of working in a team.
Yeah.
And being able to say, like, look, I'm not going to do everything, but if I can do this one little piece and I can know that someone else is going to take my little piece and build on it and build on it and build on it, that's really good. And that's a lot more hopeful than thinking like, I'm going to be the one to run for president and fix everything one day. So that's, I think, another way in which I totally get what we were talking about with Rogue One, but also wanted to kind of take on that tangent there.
Yeah, you used the word alliance before, and obviously the
Mm-hmm.
Rebel Alliance is, a thing that I think ends up making a lot more sense in Andor than
Yeah,
in the original trilogy, where it's just like, yeah, it's just the rebels, right? And it's like,
right,
oh, it's actually an alliance of all these groups that don't necessarily want the same thing, but they definitely want not
right.
one thing, right? And I think that is a powerful concept as well, where, I know I was starting off talking about, the idea of being a revolutionary and having like a vision and like a direction to go in. But I do think it's also powerful to have, a lot of people pulling on the same rope for different reasons sometimes. And like,
Yeah,
sort of like, okay, well, we know this is bad, so let's
right.
end this and then let's figure it out later. Like, that's also okay, right? There's
Yeah,
nothing wrong with that. And sometimes you get problems when, people in opposing the fascists, the anarchists and communists end up, not getting
right,
along. And then, the Spanish Civil
right.
War goes
Yeah,
in a bad direction.
And I feel like I really like that some parts of Star Wars now, more in TV and especially in the books, have started to explore, okay, well, yeah, it was great that we had this big Rebel Alliance, but once the Empire is gone, the fact that we all don't agree on what comes next actually poses some problems. And maybe we should have talked about this along the way. And for me, there's a real life example of this happening right now, in that I'm not going to claim to be an expert on Iranian politics, but I think most people on most parts of the political spectrum could agree that the Iranian government was not really very good. Religious totalitarianism, incredible oppression of women, and quite recently the murder of thousands, if not tens of thousands, of protesters. Like, if you want to say like that was an evil empire that needed to be overthrown, I'm with you on some regard.
Sure.
But I certainly don't trust the motives of the people who did it.
Yeah.
And I certainly don't think that there's an actual alliance here of everyone talking to each other and listening to each other about what's going to be for the best. And certainly the people of Iran themselves are being completely left out of those equations. So yeah, I think you're right that the alliance becomes important. And
I felt the same about Iraq, by the way, 20 however many years ago, when the US was, I was like, I don't think Hussein should be in power running a country, but I don't think the US should be running another country either.
Yeah, to me, that's the most horrifying thing, is that like we're doing the exact same thing we did there, which is also, what we did in however many left-wing governments we overthrew in Latin
Chile,
America and Africa and Asia, and Pinochet, almost always getting much worse responses.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a whole other thing. And it's about an hour. I want to kind of just lampshade two things quickly that I'll probably talk more about in other episodes, but give you a quick chance to respond, and then we can talk about your cat and then be gone. Because there's two other kind of like parts of this I think that are really important to me. One of which I'm going to get someone on, possibly Matthew Carroll, to talk about, is Star Trek has been a huge inspiration to me, but from a very different perspective, because somewhat Star Wars, but like Star Wars is really about like, look, they're pretty clear evil. There's the Emperor, there's the Stormtroopers, etc. And they've played with that some, particularly in Andor, but it's still, whereas in Star Trek, so much of that story is about the people you think are your enemy are actually people who just you have a misunderstanding with. And can we learn new ways to communicate? And can we, and for me, that's actually been really helpful as well. I love Star Wars, but also if I approach every problem as a fight where I'm looking for who's the Emperor here, who do I need to fight against? That's not great either. And so there's some need for that. What was the second thing I was going to talk about? Oh, and just that also, I think a lot of the media that I really love is the stuff that challenges me about what kind of a rebel do I want to be. And that sort of says, okay, well, you hold this idea, but what if we take it to this extreme? Do you still hold it and stuff like that? Give you a chance to comment on either one of those.
In terms of what kind of rebel do you want to be? Like, do you want to be Luthen? Do you want to be Cassian? Do you want to be Luke? Do you want to be Leia? Right. There are a lot of different examples in Star Wars. In Star Trek, it's interesting because I'm sorry. Jeez. I've never really loved Star Trek, but I feel like it is actually possibly more in line with like things that I'm interested in, in terms of like when people talk to me about the Federation, I'm like, oh, that sounds interesting, and like the things that shows are about. I like glowing swords and telekinesis and like mind control. Like I just like these things and space battles, so Star Wars like captured my imagination through visuals as much as anything, and like the music. I mean, oh man, the music. But there are a lot of Star Trek things that I think are really fascinating, and I often have seen a lot. Like I see like online disagreements. I'm not talking about like where people are just like dug in their polarized political points of view. I mean, just like talking about like normal stuff or like sports or whatever. And like I've just often found myself in a sort of like mediator kind of standpoint where, I like try and find the common ground. Where like, okay, well, if you soften that statement to something that you actually believe instead of this ridiculous hyperbole, and then you soften your statement to something that's not quite so hyperbolic, can we find some common ground where it's like you disagree, but like not really as much as you're kind of making it out to be,
Someone might think Soto is the best player on the Mets. Someone else might think Lindor, but like we're both Mets fans. Let's not
exactly
turn this into hate.
Exactly. Or like in 2024, like people pretending like, oh, well, clearly, or last, whatever, like this guy should be the MVP. No, this guy. It's like, can we start by saying, hey, at least it's close, right? Like both of these people are worthy of consideration. And then you can say why you think you prefer one or the other, as opposed to like pretending like there's some vast chasm and it's not even close, And that's just true with so many disagreements people have, I think, is people exacerbate things by indulging in hyperbole.
It's a lot more emotionally charged to fight than it is to, agree and find compromise.
De-escalation is not exciting. It's just good. I think
it doesn't make a good movie, but it does make some really good TV.
Exactly. And then I have a sort of Trekkie derived t-shirt idea that I've always wanted to make for like since 2016 or so. And everybody was like, resist. Which, I'm not clowning on people, but I wanted to make a t-shirt that said, resistance is futile. The only solution is revolution. But, basically like, if you're just spending all your time resisting, like I do think, like, not to dig too much into the politics, but I do think one of the problems with opposition to the modern day Republican Party is just saying that's bad, and not being like, this is what we're presenting that will actually help people, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. And that's a whole other topic we can get into, but I think it's a very important one. Yeah. All right. Well, we're just about at time. Tell us about one of the first rebel scums that you encountered, your cat.
Yeah. So when I was 3 years old, my neighbors, Warren and Jennifer, found a cat somewhere in New York, apparently an alley. Although where I lived near Times Square, there weren't really alleys per se. But, I like to consider her an alley cat. Like she was about 3-ish. And like had been living on the streets for who knows how long. And they found her and then they brought her to us and were like, do you guys want a cat? And I was like, yeah, we want a cat. And my parents were like, I guess we want a cat. Sure. And we had my mom and dad, they had a dog and a cat who had died when I was about 2, maybe 3. So like we hadn't been long without a cat, but that was like their pets, their friends that like I grew up with, but like were 17 and 18 and then they died. And then we got this cat who was like just such a badass. Like she's this black and white tabby cat who was like huge. And I named her Paul Christopher Hoppe Cat because of course I did. And and then I would call her PCH Cat. and then I just called her Cat eventually, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like she was Paul Christopher Hoppe Cat, and I remember being in Kansas City with my we were like upstairs in my grandparents' house, and my uncle was up there, but then my aunt and other uncle had these dogs that they had from Florida, and one of their dogs was trying to come up the stairs, and PCH Cat was just like, bam, just smacked the dog right across the face. Not like scratched her, but it was
Mm-hmm.
just like a slap, you know.
Yeah, like a backhand.
Yes.
The goal is not to do harm, is to show disrespect.
Exactly. And the dog just went running down this dog was like, 3 feet long, which is
Right.
like 2 feet high. Like it was like a mid to large dog,
Yeah.
and my cat was just like, no, this is my place. Like you go downstairs. And so, that to me is kind of rejecting the order of like dogs chase cats. She was like,
Yeah.
nah, you run from me. And then just the only other story I'll tell is like she used to sleep on my bed, and like one morning I remember I woke up and I go to get out of bed, and this wasn't like how she hit the dog, but she like took her paw and just like batted at me. And I sat back down and looked at her, and she sits down, and I go to stand up and she bats at me again. And I'm like, what? Like I have to stay here. So I, despite being a rebel myself, I did bow to the authority of my cat.
I was going to say,
occasion.
like, in Andor, one of the things they talk about is the idea of the mask of fear, that like, it's not that the ruling authority actually has power, it's that it acts like it does. And so we all acquiesce.
Yeah.
I don't think your cat was a rebel. I think it was a like petty dictator.
You might be right. You might be right.
Your dog was just like, oh, well, no, it's willing to use violence. So I guess we're wrong here.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, you're right. I have described someone willing to use violence to intimidate and oppress other species.
2 quick things I'm going to bookmark just to say, hey, I'm aware of them and aware we didn't discuss them, but I'm going to make sure they come up in another discussion. One is for myself, as someone who's autistic and neurodivergent, I'm well aware that a conversation about how much do you or do you not accept the authority of others is often very tied to that. And I think that's an important aspect to that conversation that I want to make sure gets raised. It just was not part of the scope of what we could do today. And the second thing, and Paul, I'll probably have you back on to discuss this at some point, I think there's a very interesting question of, a lot of the media that we watch about revolution is fundamentally violent. There are a couple good movies about people who just, organize marches and rallies and strikes and go to court and stuff like that. But blowing up the Death Star is generally a lot more successful on film than filing a court brief.
Right. Yeah, I think the last thing I'd say is something that I wrote down in when we were going to do this episode, I just went like and just like got some ideas out of my head. And one of them was that I've always felt like there's something wrong with the world and never felt like there was something wrong with me, which I think a lot of people let the world tell them that there's something wrong with them because they don't like the way it is. Or because it does certain things to them. And I mean, I'm not trying to say like, I don't think I'm without fault and whatever, and this and that, but just, I think an aspect of being a rebel or a revolutionary or rebel scum, is like a level of self-acceptance of just like, I'm okay. And it's okay for me to want things to be different than they are, and to fight for that. On behalf of myself and or others.
Yeah. No, I think it's true. And I think that you are unburdened by self-doubt in many aspects, in ways that I think are mostly to your good and at times deeply frustrating. But I think that's maybe part, like I said, sometimes I want to watch the movie that just wallows in how broken that things are so that I know I'm not crazy. And if you don't worry about that, then that movie isn't going to be anywhere near as appealing. So yeah, that makes sense. Anyway, thank you so much. Obviously check out Star Wars podcast that I do, that we're going to be talking about a lot of similar issues. We're also going to be talking about, probably actually by the time this episode comes out, we may be already covering Maul, Shadow Lord, a new show that He's not, I think, he is rebelling against the order of Palpatines and Darth Sidious. So, but maybe not quite the example of the kind of rebellion we want to do. But there could be some lessons there. But check out that at some point soon. Although we've been saying this for 5 to 10 to 20 years, Paul and I are going to come out with a writing podcast. I'm sort of naming it here for the first time to throw our hats over the walls that we have to follow to some extent. But when it actually happens, who the hell knows? But yeah, and also as part of that, Paul, you now have a writing blog that you're putting out. Tell people where they can find that.
zenmadman.com. And currently it's mostly poker related, but I'm looking to write some more stuff about writing and other stuff as well. So
awesome. Yeah, I've been really enjoying those. Sign up. They're definitely worthwhile. So I'm having myself, Paul, thank you all so much for listening. Let us know who was your first rebel. What made you rebel scum? I think is actually going to be the title of this. So write in, let us know. All the ways to do that are in the show notes or on the webpage. But most importantly, we have spoken.